Let's see if you still stay subscribed to me after this video. Welcome back to my channel, everyone, and today's video I'll be sharing my witchy hot takes. I recently saw 𝔇𝔢 the Norse witch do a video like this, and I thought to myself, I also have witchy hot takes that I think will get the people a bit riled up. So I'm just going to steal that idea now. But also I'll be linking 𝔇𝔢's original video down in the description and somewhere here, and I also highly encourage you to check that out. In total I have 10 hot takes, and I'm just going to share 5 with you, and the rest are going to be up on Patreon. So if you want to know more about my perhaps a bit controversial opinions on the witchcraft community and witchcraft in general, you can hop over there and watch that. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. Some folk spells cannot be easily adapted into our time and instead need to be performed in the way that they would have been performed in the past. Now, I'm always a big proponent of adapting practices. I mean, that's how practices stay alive. But for some specific instances, I don't think that there are ways to modernize them. For example, if a traditional spell compels you to go outside on a certain date and gather water from a natural source, I don't think that a modern adaptation of that spell would be potent if you substitute that natural water source for like water from your faucet. Do you know what I'm saying? And I know that nowadays many people don't really have access to natural waters in the way that they might used to in the past, but then I don't think that that spell should even be performed. Some spells shouldn't be performed if you cannot stay true to their essence, you know? Some spells can be tweaked, for example, if you need to gather a certain type of herb, but that herb is no longer really available, but you have another herb which is historically considered to be kind of similar and a good substitute, you can of course use that. But if you change that spell so radically that you substitute an herb for a crystal, for example, and substitute the date where the herbs should have been gathered for a different day, then you're doing essentially a completely different spell which will have a different kind of outcome and a different vibe to it. And at that point you're not really practicing any old form of folk magic anymore. You're doing your own thing, which is fine, but not really the old magical tradition that you claim you're practicing. Okay, next hot take. You need to learn about historic contexts when looking at old records of witchcraft. I cannot stress how important this is. And I know that really delving deep into research and historic accounts of witchcraft and folk magic might not generally be the vibe within the witchcraft community. People much more prefer to read more accessible books by modern authors. But if you really get down to it and really center in on a folk magical practice, for example, knowing the historical context in which the vast majority of sources for that practice will come from is really important. I can give an example with German folk magic. A lot of our sources come from these old folk magical grimoires, which were written somewhere in the late medieval to early modern period. And of course you will have the general folk magic gist of how to get the stolen item back, how to prevent your cattle from being cursed. But within these spells embedded, there are also notions of anti-Semitism, for example, of appropriated and misconstrued Jewish traditions, which then get regurgitated by, first of all, Christian ceremonial practitioners, and their practices then trickle down to folk magic practitioners. And these things are all recorded in these folk magical grimoires. And if you don't know this historical context, you really run the risk of accidentally replicating forms of anti-Semitism within your own craft. This is just one example, of course, but there are many instances where knowing the historical context is really paramount for understanding your practice, especially if it's drawn from any historical source. Of course, that requires a lot of work, and I know that many people in the witch community aren't necessarily up to this arguably very ginormous task of understanding the entire historical context, but I do think that it is important to try. Deity work, in my opinion, is kind of overrated, and relationships with your ancestral spirit and land spirits are a bit underrated. Especially on TikTok, I see a lot of people that are semi-new to witchcraft jumping headfirst into deity work without a real understanding of the concept of witchcraft or deity work, and with very surface level understanding of the deity that they're trying to work with in the first place, which can lead to undesired outcomes, let's just say. And generally, I feel like there's the sense that if you're a spiritual practitioner in our sphere, you need a deity to work with. It is somehow expected of you. It's one of the first things that people might ask you or that they talk about themselves. And in that way, I think we're doing ancestral spirits and land spirits kind of a injustice, because most likely they are more easy to work with in the first place because they are more related to you. And I know that deity work might look really alluring when you see all of these fancy deity altars of social media witches that have like small marble statues of Aphrodite or something, and you see these deity altars be packed with offerings and really aesthetic candles. And you also have the advantage of having resources on your deities in a mythological kind of sense. But trust me, even if you don't see it so often depicted on social media, ancestral work and land spirit work is going to be more accessible to you in the first place. It's going to be more accessible to you when you start out, and they are also more likely to be open to communication. And that's just even if you want to do spirit work in the first place. Okay, the next witchy hot tag is also really important to me personally. Non-witchy resources are oftentimes the best witchy resources. This might confuse some of you, but in my experience, this really holds true. If you pick up a book on folklore, that's not inherently witchy, but oftentimes you can draw so much good information relevant to your practice and to your general area out of a folklore book. In it, you'll find description of spirits, spirit contacts, spirit contracts, what kind of spirits are in what area, what they like and dislike, etc. If you watch a nature documentary about your area, you'll start noticing things about your seasons, about your animals, about your plant life that could be useful to you in your practice. Suddenly you know what herbs are native to your region. You know what not to pick because it's endangered. You know what to get rid of because it's invasive. You know what you could maybe use medicinally or in some magical working. If you start noticing the animals of your area, you can look up their magical associations and folklore with them in it. All of these things are very valuable for you if you practice witchcraft, and especially if you practice folk magic. And all of these things are mainly learned through non-witchy resources. I know I already talked about Google Maps as a resource. When you don't live in the area where you take your magic from, you can just plop yourself into Google Maps, into Street View, and look around that area. What is that area like? What does it feel like? You can look up the weather that they currently have. And so you can get a feeling for the landscape, seasons, nature, and even culture for specific regions, all of which are going to help you in your practice. And I don't think that you'll be able to learn all of these things in a book about a general introduction into witchcraft, for example. Okay, next hot take. Declaring yourself as a witch is inherently a political statement. I know many might be very anti-politics. I know that many just want to do aesthetic, spiritual things and don't really think of themselves as political. But the label of witch is kind of a political statement if you ascribe it to yourself. Historically, a witch has always been the outsider, the underdog, most often the person with a negative intent. This notion that a witch can be something positive is fairly new. Of course, we have old historical depictions of magic practitioners which are more positive, but then they are not described as witches. So taking this very historically negative term of a witch and ascribing that to yourself in the modern day is something political. It is declaring yourself as the underdog. It is taking this negative thing and twisting it into something positive. It's changing the meaning. It's shifting the public perception of what a witch can be. That's already inherently political. And we haven't even talked about the many organizations and movements which have used the word witch, historically speaking, to fight for liberation. So yeah, these were all of my witchy hot takes. I hope you don't hate me. I hope you could kind of get where I was coming from And if you have some witchy hot takes or thoughts about my hot takes, you can drop them down in the comments. And with that, we come to my Patreon shoutouts. Shout out to Christania and Crabapple Witch. Shout out to Chaya and Brian. And shout out to Rini and Willow Rose Witch. And with that, I wish that you have a great rest of your day. And Lori wat goed gaan.